Pack your bags, princess. Real soldiers are working here. Lena Park didn't say a word when Staff Sergeant Alvarez shoved her aside. Just stared at the rifle she wasn't allowed to touch. This is a $200,000 precision weapon, and you're a diversity hire. Private Collins laughed. Maybe she can hold our makeup bags. Your daddy's connections won't help you here. This is men's work. Lena said nothing, but something flickered in her eyes. What Alvarez didn't know was about to destroy his career forever. If you want your own story written, just write your name in the comments. You could be the hero of our next story. 3 hours later, something would happen in the Nevada desert, and Staff Sergeant Alvarez would never be the same again. But first, let's start 24 hours earlier. Welcome to Quiet Tales Studio. Before we tell this powerful story of silence, skill, and forgotten legacy, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. The Falcon Ridge testing facility sprawled across 30 square miles of unforgiving Nevada desert. It was where the military's most advanced weapon systems came to prove themselves or fail spectacularly. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the mountain ridges when the first vehicles began arriving at the secured compound. Private Lena Park stepped out of the transport truck, her boots hitting the dusty ground with quiet precision. At 24 years old, she was compact but athletic, with the kind of steady hands that had been steady since childhood. Her personnel file listed her as Equipment Management Specialist, a role that sounded important, but mostly meant she carried things for other people and took notes. What her file didn't mention was the hours she'd spent in the Virginia mountains with her father, Master Sergeant Daniel Park, learning to read wind patterns like sheet music and calculating bullet trajectories before she could solve algebra. Her father had taught her that the best shooters weren't always the loudest ones, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one nobody noticed. Staff Sergeant Miguel Alvarez arrived in his own vehicle, windows down, music blasting. 15 years of active duty had carved lines into his face and confidence into his swagger. He was the kind of soldier who wore his achievements like armor, and his reputation as the facility's top marksman was well earned through countless competitions and training exercises. But Alvarez had a problem with female soldiers. Not officially, of course. He was too smart for overt discrimination. Instead, he used 1,000 small cuts, dismissive comments, excluded conversations, assignments that kept women on the periphery of real action. To him, the military was being weakened by political correctness, and soldiers like Lena Park were walking proof of declining standards. Park! His voice cut across the morning air like a whip crack. You're with me today. Try not to break anything expensive. Lena shouldered her gear bag and followed without comment. She'd learned early that responding to provocations only made them worse. The testing facility's main range stretched out before them like a moonscape. Targets were positioned at progressive distances from 500 meters out to an ambitious 3,200 meters, where the curvature of the Earth itself became a factor in ballistic calculations. Today's mission was to evaluate the new XM-25 Advanced Precision Rifle, a weapon system that incorporated cutting-edge computer-assisted targeting with traditional marksmanship skills. Dr. Carter, the civilian contractor overseeing the technical aspects, briefed the assembled team. "Gentlemen and lady," he added with a glance at Lena, "today we're testing the outer limits of what's possible with small arms precision shooting. The XM-25 represents a quantum leap forward in integrated targeting systems." Captain Reynolds, the officer in charge of the evaluation, nodded toward the distant targets. "We need clean data at every distance interval. Multiple shooters, controlled conditions, documented results. This rifle could revolutionize long-range engagement protocols." Alvarez stepped forward. "Sir, I'll handle the primary shooting sequence. I've got the most experience with experimental systems." His eyes flicked dismissively toward Lena. "Park can assist with data collection and equipment management." For the next 3 hours, Lena watched as Alvarez and 2 other qualified marksmen put the XM-25 through its paces. The rifle performed admirably at conventional distances, consistently hitting targets out to 1,800 meters. The computer-assisted scope calculated wind drift atmospheric pressure, and temperature variations with impressive accuracy. But as the targets moved beyond 2,500 meters, problems began to emerge. "Damn it," Alvarez muttered after his third consecutive miss at 2,750 meters. "The system keeps overcorrecting for something." Dr. Carter frowned at his tablet. The atmospheric modeling should be accounting for all environmental variables. Perhaps we need to recalibrate the sensors. Private Collins, one of Alvarez's regular shooting partners, squinted through a spotting scope. "I can barely see the target at this distance. How are we supposed to hit what we can't see clearly?" Lena stood quietly to one side, clipboard in hand, officially recording data, but actually observing everything else. She watched the way heat waves rose from the valley floor in complex patterns. She noted how the wind flags at different distances showed conflicting directions. Most importantly, she saw something the computer systems couldn't detect. A thermal inversion layer about 800 meters downrange that was bending light and air currents in unpredictable ways. Her father had taught her to recognize these phenomena during hunting trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. "The mountain makes its own weather," he told her, "and every valley has its own personality. Learn to read it, or go home empty-handed." "Pa!" Alvarez's sharp command snapped her attention back to the immediate situation. "Make yourself useful. Hold this rifle while I check the scope settings." Lena accepted the weapon, immediately noting its balance point and the slight vibration that suggested an imperfectly seated barrel. As Alvarez hunched over technical manuals with Dr. Carter, she allowed herself to really examine the XM-25 for the first time. The rifle was undeniably impressive. Carbon fiber stock, match-grade barrel, an electronic scope that looked like something from a science fiction movie. But as her fingers traced its contours, she realized it was trying to do too much. The computer systems were sophisticated, but they were making assumptions about conditions that didn't match the reality of this particular valley. "What do you think you're doing?" Alvarez had noticed her examining the weapon. "Nothing, Sergeant. Just holding it as instructed." "You better be. This rifle costs more than your car, your apartment, and probably your entire education combined." Private Collins snickered. Maybe she thinks she could do better. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Lena felt every eye turn toward her, and for a moment, the familiar weight of being underestimated pressed down on her shoulders. She could stay quiet, accept her role as an observer, and let them continue their unsuccessful attempts. "Or, I was just wondering," she said quietly, "if anyone had considered disabling the computer assistance for the extreme-range shots." The silence that followed was immediate and profound. Alvarez's face darkened. "Excuse me? The atmospheric modeling is based on theoretical conditions," Lena continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But there's a thermal inversion about 800 meters out that's creating wind shear. The computer can't see it, so it's compensating for conditions that don't actually exist." Dr. Carter looked up from his tablet, suddenly interested. "How can you tell there's a thermal inversion?" "The way the mirage patterns shift," Lena explained. "And look at the vegetation on the far ridge. The trees on the south face are moving differently than the ones on the north face. That indicates layered air currents." Alvarez's laugh was sharp and mocking. 15 years of combat experience, multiple marksmanship awards, instructor qualifications at 3 different schools, and now I'm getting advice from a supply clerk who probably learned to shoot at summer camp. "I learned from my father," Lena said simply. "Oh, right. Daddy taught you to hunt deer. That must make you an expert on military precision shooting." Alvarez's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Tell me, sweetheart, what makes you think you understand ballistics better than professionals who've been doing this since before you were born?" The gathered personnel shifted uncomfortably. Even Captain Reynolds looked uncertain about how to handle the escalating tension. Lena met Alvarez's gaze directly. "My father was Master Sergeant Daniel Park, Marine Corps Scout Sniper. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan and held the long-distance record at Camp Pendleton for 6 years." The name seemed to register with Captain Reynolds, whose expression shifted slightly. But Alvarez wasn't impressed. "So you're living off Daddy's reputation. That's even worse." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think because your old man could shoot, That somehow makes you qualified to question my methods? You think genetics gives you the right to embarrass me in front of my team? Lena didn't step back. I think the rifle would perform better if you trusted the shooter instead of the computer. Prove it. The words came out before Alvarez seemed to realize he was saying them. The challenge hung in the desert air like a dare that couldn't be taken back. Captain Reynolds intervened. Alvarez, that's not necessary. Private Park isn't qualified for experimental weapons testing. But Alvarez was committed now, his pride engaged in a way that made backing down impossible. No, sir. If she's got opinions about how this should be done, let's see her put her money where her mouth is. One shot. At 2,900 meters. When she misses, maybe she'll learn to stay in her lane. Dr. Carter looked nervous. Sergeant, this weapon has never been fired by unqualified personnel. The liability issues alone. One shot, Alvarez repeated, staring at Lena. Miss, and you admit you don't belong here. Hit the target, and I'll personally recommend you for advanced marksmanship training. Lena looked around at the assembled faces. Some showed curiosity, others skepticism. Private Collins was barely suppressing laughter. But Captain Reynolds was studying her with the kind of attention usually reserved for tactical briefings. All right, she said quietly. One shot. The next few minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Dr. Carter reluctantly agreed to allow the attempt, muttering about insurance and protocols. The spotting team set up their equipment. Captain Reynolds called the range control tower to ensure clear airspace. And Lena found herself lying behind the most advanced rifle she'd ever touched, staring through a scope at a target so distant it was barely visible even with maximum magnification. She began by disabling every computer-assisted function on the rifle, returning it to purely mechanical operation. This drew immediate protests from Dr. Carter and nervous laughter from the other shooters. She's flying blind, Collins whispered. This is going to be embarrassing. But Lena wasn't flying blind. She was flying on instinct honed by years of mountain hunting, guided by lessons learned from one of the Marine Corps' most accomplished snipers. She spent nearly 2 minutes just breathing, letting her heart rate settle, feeling the rifle's natural point of aim. Then she began to read the wind, not with instruments or computers, but with eyes that had been trained to see what others missed. The subtle differences in vegetation movement. The way dust devils formed and dissipated across the valley floor. The shimmer patterns that revealed invisible rivers of air moving at different temperatures and speeds. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The wind is never just one thing, baby girl. It's a symphony of currents, and you have to hear the whole song before you take your shot. She made minute adjustments to the scope, calculating not just for the primary wind direction, but for the complex interactions of multiple air masses. Distance wasn't just about bullet drop. At this range, the Earth's rotation became a factor. Temperature gradients would affect the bullet's flight path differently at various altitudes above the desert floor. The mathematics of it all flowed through her mind like music, equations her father had taught her to solve instinctively rather than consciously. "Any time now, Annie Oakley," Alvarez called out. "We don't have all day." Lena tuned him out. In that moment, there was only her, the rifle, and the distant target. Her breathing slowed to a deep, rhythmic cycle. Her finger found the trigger's natural break point and waited. She watched the wind flags at 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters, 2,000 meters, learning their pattern. There was a rhythm to it, a cyclical shift that repeated every 45 seconds. She waited for the right moment in the cycle, when all the variables aligned. Inhale, hold, release half, hold again. The shot surprised even her when it went off, the rifle bucking against her shoulder with authority. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The bullet was traveling over half a mile through shifting air currents, fighting gravity and atmospheric resistance every inch of the way. Then, through the spotting scope, a small puff of dust erupted from exactly where the target stood. "Holy!" someone whispered. "Target hit," Captain Reynolds called out, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Confirmed hit at 2,900 meters. No computer assistance. The range fell silent except for the faint ringing in everyone's ears from the rifle's report. Dr. Carter was staring at his instruments in confusion. That's not possible. The ballistic calculations show that shot should have missed by at least 3 feet. Unless, Captain Reynolds said slowly, the ballistic calculations were wrong. All eyes turned to Lena, who was calmly safing the weapon and preparing to stand up. She moved with the measured precision of someone who had just done exactly what she intended to do. No more and no less. Alvarez's face had gone through several color changes, settling on a pale shade that matched the desert sand. His mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. How? Captain Reynolds asked the question everyone was thinking. Lena stood and brushed dust off her uniform. Like I said, Sergeant, the computer was fighting against the actual conditions. Sometimes you have to trust the shooter instead of the machine. The implications of what had just happened began to sink in. A soldier who wasn't even qualified for advanced marksmanship training had succeeded where certified experts had failed. She had done it on her first attempt, with a weapon she'd never fired before, at a distance that pushed the absolute limits of small arms effectiveness. Captain Reynolds was already reaching for his radio. Base, this is Reynolds at Test Range 7. I need to speak with Colonel Martinez immediately. Priority Alpha. Dr. Carter was frantically taking notes, trying to understand how his carefully calibrated computer models had been so thoroughly outperformed by human intuition. And Staff Sergeant Alvarez was learning what it felt like to have 15 years of professional reputation crumble in the space of a single rifle shot. But for Lena Park, the most important thing was the voice she could almost hear on the desert wind. Her father's voice, carried on the same currents she'd used to guide her bullet to its target. "That's my girl," it seemed to whisper. "That's my girl." The story was far from over. Word of the impossible shot would spread through military channels like wildfire. Phone calls would be made, orders would be cut, lives would change. But in that moment, standing in the Nevada desert with a smoking rifle in her hands and the taste of victory on her lips, Lena Park allowed herself to smile. Staff Sergeant Alvarez would never call her princess again. 4 hours later, the Falcon Ridge Facilities Communications Center buzzed with unprecedented activity. What had started as a routine weapons test had become the kind of event that generated priority messages to Pentagon offices and Joint Chiefs of Staff. Colonel Martinez arrived by helicopter, accompanied by 2 officers Lena didn't recognize. Their conversation with Captain Reynolds was brief and conducted out of earshot, but their frequent glances in her direction suggested she was the primary topic. Dr. Carter had spent the intervening hours running computer simulations, trying to understand how Lena's shot had succeeded where his models predicted failure. His preliminary conclusion, delivered with obvious reluctance, was that human observation had detected environmental factors too subtle for electronic sensors to register. "It's not that the technology is inadequate," he explained to the assembled officers. "It's that Specialist Park was perceiving conditions that our instruments couldn't measure. The thermal layering she identified was real, but it was happening in microclimates too small for our atmospheric sensors to detect." Staff Sergeant Alvarez had requested permission to leave the range early, citing administrative duties. His request was denied. Instead, he found himself summoned to Colonel Martinez's temporary field office for what was euphemistically called a counseling session. The conversation behind closed doors was brief but intense. When Alvarez emerged 20 minutes later, his face was the color of concrete, and he avoided eye contact with everyone, especially Lena. "Private Park," Colonel Martinez called out as the sun began to set over the desert mountains. "A word, please." The colonel was a compact man with silver hair, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested he'd seen everything the military had to offer and wasn't easily impressed. He gestured for Lena to join him near the facility's observation tower, away from the others. "I've been shooting for 32 years, he began without preamble. "Started as a Marine grunt. Worked my way up through every marksmanship program the Corps offers. I've seen natural talent, and I've seen hard work. But what you did today..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you did today was something else entirely." Lena maintained her military bearing. "Thank you, sir. That wasn't a compliment, Private. That was a statement of fact." Martinez's tone sharpened slightly. The question now is what we do about it. A soldier with your capabilities doesn't belong in equipment management. Hell, you probably don't belong at a testing facility. Before Lena could respond, Martinez continued. I've been authorized to offer you an immediate transfer to the Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning. Full qualification training, competition team consideration, the works. It would mean promotion to specialist, advanced training, and eventually instructor credentials. The offer hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Everything Lena had ever wanted professionally, handed to her because of 30 seconds of trigger time and a lifetime of preparation. There's one condition, Martinez added. You'd be starting at the bottom of a very competitive program. The AMU doesn't care about your gender, your background, or your father's reputation. They care about results. You'd be competing against soldiers who've been training for this their entire careers. I understand, sir. Martinez studied her for a long moment. I don't think you do. The Army Marksmanship Unit isn't just about shooting. It's about representing the United States in international competition. It's about training the trainers who will teach the next generation of military marksmen. It's about setting standards that the entire armed forces will follow. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and handed it to her. Your transfer orders. If you accept, you report to Fort Benning in 72 hours. If you decline, you return to your current assignment, and we pretend today never happened. Lena opened the folder, scanning the official documents that would reshape her military career. At the bottom of the transfer order, she noticed an additional notation. Recommended for accelerated advancement pending performance evaluation. Sir, what happens to Staff Sergeant Alvarez? Martinez's expression didn't change. Sergeant Alvarez is being transferred to a position more suited to his current skill level. Equipment maintenance at Fort Irwin. He'll have plenty of time to practice his marksmanship on his own time. The justice of it was immediate and complete. The man who had tried to humiliate her for sport would spend the remainder of his career counting ammunition and cleaning rifles while she trained with the military's elite marksmen. Do you need time to consider the offer? Martinez asked. Lena looked out across the desert range where her life had changed with a single shot. In the distance, she could see Staff Sergeant Alvarez loading equipment into transport vehicles, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. No, sir. I accept. Martinez nodded, as if he'd expected no other answer. Good. Captain Reynolds will handle your out-processing. You'll want to call your family before the news hits official channels. As the colonel walked away, Lena realized she was holding her breath. 3 hours ago, she had been an equipment specialist whose most significant contribution was carrying clipboards and taking notes. Now she was heading to the most prestigious marksmanship program in the military, recommended for advancement, with a future limited only by her own abilities. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Heard about your shot. Your father would be proud. Welcome to the big leagues. SGM Williams AMU. That night, as Lena packed her gear for the journey to Fort Benning, she found herself thinking about all the small moments that had led to this one. Her father's patient instruction in the Virginia mountains. The hours of practice that had seemed like play. The quiet confidence that came from knowing your capabilities without needing to prove them to anyone. And she thought about Staff Sergeant Alvarez, who would wake up tomorrow in a world where his assumptions about who belonged had been permanently shattered. Sometimes, Lena reflected, justice came not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet precision of a well-placed shot. The princess had become the queen of her own story, and the kingdom would never be the same. 6 months later, Fort Benning. Specialist Lena Park stood at the firing line of the Army Marksmanship Unit's advanced training facility, addressing a classroom of 20 elite shooters from various military branches. Her demonstration on complex wind pattern recognition had just concluded, leaving the room in respectful attention. Questions? She asked, surveying faces that included sergeants and officers with decades more experience than her. A Navy SEAL in the back row raised his hand. With respect, specialist, what you're describing sounds like instinct more than technique. How do you teach instinct? Lena nodded, having expected the question. You can't teach instinct directly, but you can teach observation. You can teach patience. And you can teach people to trust what they see over what instruments tell them they should see. The SEAL looked skeptical but nodded. The key, Lena continued, is understanding that every environment has its own personality. Computer models are based on averages, but when you're taking a shot that matters, you're not dealing with averages. You're dealing with the specific conditions in that specific place at that specific moment. After the class dismissed, Lena found a message waiting on her desk. She'd been selected to represent the United States at the International Military Shooting Championships in Switzerland. 3 years of competition, training with the world's best marksmen, representing her country on the global stage. That evening, she called her father's old unit to share the news. The current commanding officer, a Colonel Peterson who had served with Master Sergeant Daniel Park, listened with obvious pride. "Your dad talked about you constantly," Peterson told her. "He always said you had the gift, but he was worried the military wouldn't know what to do with it. Looks like he was wrong about that last part." "He was right about the first part, though," Lena replied. "Everything I know, I learned from him." "Everything you knew," Peterson corrected gently. "What you've become since then, that's all you." As Lena hung up the phone, she thought about Staff Sergeant Alvarez, whose career had taken a very different trajectory. According to unofficial reports, he'd applied twice for transfer back to active shooting duties and been denied both times. His current assignment involved inventory management and weapons maintenance. Important work, but far removed from the prestige he'd once enjoyed. More significantly, his behavior at Falcon Ridge had triggered a comprehensive review of his past conduct. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of discrimination and unprofessional behavior that had been overlooked or ignored by previous commanders. His recent application for promotion to Sergeant First Class had been not just denied, but marked not eligible for reconsideration. The arc of justice, Lena reflected, was sometimes swift and sometimes slow, but it was remarkably thorough. Her phone buzzed with a notification. A news article from a military publication. "Female marksman breaks gender barriers in elite competition." The article featured a photo of her at the range, rifle in hand, with a caption that read, "Specialist Park's unconventional path to elite marksmanship challenges traditional assumptions about military training." She scrolled through the comments, noting the mixture of praise and skepticism that seemed to follow any story about women in combat roles. But buried among the debates was a comment that made her smile. "I was at Falcon Ridge that day. Saw the whole thing. This girl is the real deal. Retired SGM." Another comment caught her attention. "My daughter wants to join the Army now because of soldiers like Specialist Park. Thank you for showing her what's possible." Lena closed her phone and walked to the window of her quarters, looking out over the ranges where tomorrow's shooters were training under floodlights. Somewhere among them was the next underestimated soldier who would surprise everyone with what they could accomplish when given the chance. The lesson of that day in the Nevada desert wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about the danger of assumptions, the power of preparation meeting opportunity, and the truth that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places. Staff Sergeant Alvarez had learned that lesson the hard way. But for every Alvarez who held others back, there were dozens of leaders who recognized talent regardless of where it came from. And for every young soldier who felt dismissed or underestimated, there was now proof that one perfect shot could change everything. The desert wind still whispered with her father's voice, "That's my girl." But now it carried a new message, one meant for every soldier who had ever been told they didn't belong. Show them what you can do. Have you ever met someone who was underestimated until they proved everyone wrong? Share their story in the comments. And if you think stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to Quiet Tales Studio. We'll see you in the next one.